In this video, I will share how I do a tubular casting on for a simple rib consisting of the alternating knit and purl stitches. The cast on stitches look like they roll over the edge without the visible cast on roll. I will show how I do this in the round with a special method of a jogless connection in a circle. If you take a close look at the area where the yarn tail is, that's the beginning of the knitting, and it is completely jogless. I have this method shown also in my other video about a tubular casting on for a 2x2 rib, where I use a short circular needle. But for this video, I decided to do it differently. I will show how it can be done using a magic loop technique. I will use a worsted weight yarn, a 38-inch long or 97 centimeters long circular needle, size US 3 or 3.25 millimeters for casting on and for the tubular part. A slightly larger needle for the rib, size US 4 or 3.5 millimeters. A blunt tapestry needle for removing the jog, and a marker. For my sample, I will cast on 70 stitches. I pre-measure the length of the yarn for casting on by wrapping it around the needle. First, I wrap the yarn 35 times. Then I take it off the needle and measure 2 of this length. 2 times 35 is 70. And I will add about 10 centimeters or 4 inches extra. So my first cast on stitch is going to be approximately here. For casting on, I place my index finger under the working yarn and my thumb under the tail of yarn. My first stitch is a purl stitch without a knot. I place the needle on the yarn and make a twist. For the following stitch, I place the needle under the tail of yarn, over the working yarn, and turn. This is a knit stitch. Then, under the working yarn, over the tail, and make a purl stitch. Purl stitches look like they have a little bump. And repeat. Under the tail of yarn, over the working yarn, a knit stitch, under the working yarn and over the tail, a purl stitch. Again, under the tail of yarn, over the working yarn, a knit stitch, under the working yarn and over the tail, a purl stitch. Under the tail, over the working yarn, knit stitch, under the working yarn and over the tail, a purl stitch. Under the tail of yarn and over the working yarn, a knit stitch. You can see that the stitches appear paired together. I have now 5 pairs of stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So altogether I have 10 stitches. I will continue casting on under the working yarn and over the tail, under the tail and over the working yarn, under the working yarn, over the tail, under the tail, over the working yarn, under the working yarn and over the tail, under the tail, over the working yarn, and so on. For a rib 1 by 1, I need to cast on an even number of stitches, and in my case, it's 70 stitches. Here I'm at the end of the cast on row. I'm casting on the last few stitches, and because it is an even number of stitches, my last stitch is a knit stitch. This is the last stitch. Now I'm turning the work clockwise, making sure I hold my last cast on stitches to secure them, so my cast on row does not fall apart. I prepare my right hand needle tip, and now I'm ready for the tubular part. I'm going to proceed now with the tubular part. And the tubular part has an even number of rows or rounds, usually 2 to 4, to maintain the symmetry. The first row, I'm going to work flat in the opposite direction, not yet in a circle. I will work only the knit stitches and slip the purl stitches purlwise, with yarn in front of work. For the first row only, I will work the knit stitches from right to left to avoid twisted stitches. I wrap the yarn tail around my ring finger to secure it, and I'm going to slip off the first purl stitch purlwise. I move my right needle tip under the working yarn and insert it from right to left into the purl stitch. Slip it off the left needle tip and move under the working yarn like this, and right away knit into the following knit stitch from right to left. Now the beginning of the row is secure and I can release the yarn tail. And I continue by slipping off the purl stitches from right to left with yarn in front of work and knitting the knit stitches from right to left. I place the working yarn in front of work, insert my right needle tip from right to left into the purl stitch and slip it off the left needle. Then knit the knit stitch from right to left. Again, yarn in front of work, slip the purl stitch from right to left. Knit the knit stitch from right to left. Yarn in front, slip the purl stitch from right to left, knit the knit stitch from right to left. Slip the purl stitch purlwise with yarn in front, knit the knit stitch from right to left. Slip the purl stitch purlwise, yarn in front, knit the knit stitch from right to left. Slip the purl stitch with yarn in front. This is the last stitch. It is a knit stitch, and I will knit it from left to right to give it an extra twist for a straight corner. Next, I'm going to connect in a circle. I spread the stitches evenly on my circular needle. Then bring the beginning and the end of the row together. Find an approximate area of the center of the row, somewhere here, and pull the cord out, creating a loop. And bringing the needle tips parallel each other. Like this. Now I check that my work is not twisted. The yarn tail is on the left and the working yarn is on the right. I pull out the right hand needle tip, creating another loop for my magic loop. So I have two loops now on both sides. This is the yarn tail. I'm just going to move it out of the way here. This is the second loop. And I'm ready to connect in a circle. On the second round, I work only the purl stitches and slip the knit stitches purlwise with yarn behind the work. My first stitch is a purl stitch, so I make a purl stitch. In this area, it's very important to tighten the working yarn to avoid baggy stitches. And I bring all the stitches a little bit closer to the tip of my needle for convenience. The following stitch is a knit stitch. I slip it off purlwise with yarn behind work. Then purl a purl stitch, again slip a knit stitch from right to left with yarn behind, purl a purl stitch, slip a knit stitch off from right to left, yarn behind, make a purl stitch, slip the knit stitch purlwise, yarn behind, make a purl stitch, bring the stitches a little bit closer to the tip of my needle so I don't overstretch my work, and continue. Slip off the knit stitch purlwise with yarn behind, make a purl stitch, slip off the knit stitch purlwise, yarn behind, make a purl stitch, slip off the knit stitch, yarn behind, make a purl stitch, slip off the knit stitch purlwise, yarn behind, make a purl stitch, slip off the knit stitch, purl a purl stitch. Now I'm halfway through my second round of tubular knitting. I turn my work so that the right hand needle tip is below, then pull the cord out to bring the stitches onto the left hand needle tip. Like this. My needle tips are again going to be parallel each other. And now I pull the right hand needle tip out, creating a loop. And I again have two loops of my magic loop. And I continue the second round of the tubular part. So my next stitch now is a knit stitch. I place the working yarn behind work, insert my right needle tip purlwise and slip the knit stitch off. Then again purl a purl stitch, tighten a little bit because it's a changeover point, and then slip off the knit stitch, yarn behind, purl a purl stitch, slip off the knit stitch, make a purl stitch, slip off the knit stitch, make a purl stitch, and slip off the last knit stitch with yarn behind work. Now I have completed 2 tubular rounds. I turn my work around and again pull out the cord to bring the stitches onto the left needle tip. And pull out the right needle tip, creating a loop. So the tubular part is finished, and you can observe it a little bit closer. The rolled over stitches. Now I'm going to knit the rib, and I will change my needle size to a slightly larger one. So I'm switching from a 3.25 millimeters to a 3.5 millimeters needle. Using different needle sizes helps to avoid a flared edge. So I'm removing my smaller needle tip and replacing it with a little bit larger one. It's very easy to do with the interchangeable needles, or if you don't have the interchangeable needles, then you can use the regular ones. Just start this new part using a different needle size. My first stitch is a purl stitch. Followed by a knit stitch, and then a purl stitch, knit stitch, purl stitch, and so on. So now I will continue knitting the stitches as they appear in the usual way. The purl stitch purlwise as usual, and tightening this area because it's a changeover point to avoid baggy stitches, and then continue the rib, knitting the knit stitches as usual from left to right and purling the purl stitches from right to left. I will continue knitting the rib and we'll see you at the end of the round. Here I'm finishing the round, the last few stitches. This is how it looks. And again, I'm going to pull out the cord to bring the left hand needle tip in and pull the right hand needle tip out for my magic loop. I purl the first purl stitch and tighten at the changeover point to avoid baggy stitches, and continue the rib as usual, alternating knit stitches and purl stitches. I will knit a few more rounds to make my sample more substantial, and then I will show how to make this jog disappear. Here I've completed a few rounds to make my sample more substantial, so it's a bit easier to see how everything looks. And this is the jog. So we're going to make this disappear. First, I place a marker of the beginning of my work, because after I remove the jog, it will be quite difficult to see where the beginning was. So this is the yarn tail. I slightly twist it and thread it on my tapestry needle. If we look at this area a little bit closer, then we can see sort of a unfinished stitch to the right of the yarn tail. And I insert my tapestry needle back to front into that stitch and pull the yarn tail through. And then turn my work around And again, to the right of the yarn tail, there is an unfinished stitch. I insert my tapestry needle into that stitch, front to back, and into the next stitch, back to front, and pull the yarn tail through. And just slightly tighten. I'll move the yarn tail out of the way so we can see everything much better. So this is it. This is our jogless connection in a circle. It's a continuous edge. Without a jog. I hope you liked this video, and I'll see you in the next one.